Have you ever wondered if your dreams are more than just dreams? What if they are ancient memories calling you home? What if within every heartbeat, every breath, there lies a hidden seed planted by civilizations far older than Earth itself, waiting for the moment you remember who you truly are? Tonight, you will journey through a world unseen by ordinary eyes. You will step into the hidden resonance connecting all life. Feel the silent war raging across unseen currents. And witness the first pulse of humanity's forgotten awakening. As the silent battle unfolds, one man stands at the threshold between oblivion and transcendence. Will he unlock the ancient code sleeping within him, or fall into the endless silence that has swallowed countless souls before? Stay with us, and ask yourself, when your moment comes, will you have the courage to awaken? This is the seed of awakening, and your journey begins now. The first thing he noticed was the silence. A silence so vast, so absolute, that it seemed to cradle the very edges of existence. Floating in a darkness thick as velvet, he found himself standing, if standing was even the right word, on a stretch of ground woven from light itself. It was a garden, but no earthly garden. The trees were slender pillars of translucent crystal, their branches stretching into fractal patterns that shimmered with every color the human eye could barely comprehend. Leaves fluttered like sheets of living aurora, whispering not with sound but with pulsing waves of thought, rippling outward into the star-filled abyss. Above him, the sky was not a sky at all but a living ocean of stars, each one breathing in slow, deliberate rhythms. Some stars drifted like enormous dandelion seeds caught in an endless, unseen current, weaving between the branches as if drawn by an ancient memory. The air, if there was air, was cool and humming with a low, resonant frequency that bypassed the ears and went straight to the soul. Every breath he took felt electric, every blink of his eyes sending ripples through the liquid-like surface beneath his feet. He tried to speak, but his voice dissolved into golden dust, absorbed by the shimmering atmosphere. Words were unnecessary here. Understanding flowed naturally, like rivers coursing through hidden valleys. He realized, without knowing how, that he was not merely dreaming. He had crossed into a threshold where dreams touched the marrow of reality itself. In the center of the garden, a towering tree stood apart, a colossus of living starlight. Its trunk spiraled upward, vanishing into a point where the colors of existence collapsed into pure white brilliance. At its roots lay a single seed, no larger than a pebble, yet radiating a gravity so profound that it seemed to bend the garden around it. He felt drawn to it, each step an unspoken promise, a call written into the ancient fibers of his being. As he approached, a voice, not a voice made of sound, but of feeling, of memory, bloomed within him. "You have always been part of us," it said, "and now, it is time to remember." With those words, the seed lifted itself gently from the soil, hovered in front of him, and split open. A flood of blinding, iridescent light surged forth, rushing toward him, engulfing him, entering him. He felt himself dissolving, his edges blurring into the light, becoming part of something infinitely older, infinitely larger. He saw flashes, other worlds, ancient civilizations of beings made of thought and light, seeds planted across galaxies, sleeping quietly inside countless forms of life. And he understood, he carried within him a fragment of a design older than humanity itself, a code waiting for the right moment to awaken. The last thing he saw before everything faded was the garden itself fracturing into countless beams of light, each one diving into his chest, anchoring themselves inside him. And then, a soft whisper trailing behind, "Awaken." He woke up with a gasp, drenched in cold sweat, his heart thundering like a drum against his ribs. But even as he sat in the dimness of his room, the after-images of that place, the scent of starlight, the pulse of the garden lingered inside him, more real than anything he had ever known. Something ancient had been stirred. And it was only the beginning. The world he returned to felt wrong. The room around him, the worn wooden floor, the soft creak of the night wind at the window was still the same. But something fundamental had shifted, as if reality itself had become a thin veil, barely concealing the deeper currents that pulsed beneath its surface. He sat there, breathing heavily, and for a moment he simply listened. Not with his ears, but with something newly opened inside him. He could feel the potted fern on the windowsill stretching its leaves toward the unseen warmth of starlight. He could sense the slow, rhythmic heartbeat of the stray cat curled up on the porch, dreaming ancient dreams of sun and wildness. Beyond that, even the towering oak trees that lined the street radiated a subtle hum, a low vibration, like the slow, patient murmur of ancient sentinels standing guard over the sleeping world. Each living being pulsed with a unique frequency, a signature written in vibrations of light and thought. He was not hearing them with sound, nor seeing them with sight. He was remembering them. It was as though a forgotten language was rising within him, older than words, older than breath, a primordial bond between all forms of life. At first, the sensations were gentle, like ripples across a still pond. But as he focused, the waves deepened. He could feel the life force within the cat stirring with each breath. He could taste the delicate emotions blooming inside a spider weaving its web in the corner of the ceiling, tiny hopes, patient craft, silent devotion to its invisible art. Even the dust motes floating in the slanting moonlight seemed to dance with purpose, swirling in slow, deliberate spirals that echoed the cosmic patterns of distant galaxies. It was overwhelming, beautiful, and terrifying. He stumbled to his feet, every step sending echoes through the living tapestry now laid bare before him. His own body, too, was a symphony of resonances, 1,000 instruments of bone, blood, thought, and spirit playing a song he had never noticed before. For a fleeting instant, he wondered if he was losing his mind. But deep down, deeper than fear, deeper than logic, he knew the truth: this was not madness. It was the peeling away of blindness. The world was alive in ways he had never conceived, layered with countless streams of thought, memory, and consciousness, all interwoven into a singular, breathing entity. And somehow, inexplicably, he had been handed the gift, the curse of hearing its silent chorus. As he reached the front door, drawn by the invisible threads of life outside, the night opened itself to him like a living book. The trees whispered to one another in slow, ancient conversations. The grass exhaled joy at the caress of the moonlight. High above, a hawk spiraled silently through the dark, riding unseen currents of thought as easily as wind. And all of it was connected by a pulse, a rhythm, a thrum that seemed to emanate from the deepest heart of the universe itself. Standing there in the threshold between his small, silent house and the vast, breathing world beyond, he realized something chilling and wonderful: he could no longer separate himself from it. There was no boundary, no division. He was a thread in the tapestry, a note in the song. And whatever had been set in motion within him was not meant for him alone. It was calling him outward, pulling him towards something he could not yet name, a purpose seated within his very being, waiting to unfold. And somewhere, just beyond the limits of his newly awakened senses, something was watching, waiting for him to take the first step. The days that followed unfolded like pages from a book he had never agreed to read, yet could not put down. Each morning he awoke to a world both familiar and alien, where the ordinary surfaces of things, tables, stones, blades of grass, now shimmered with unseen stories, the hidden imprints of their long existence whispering at the edge of his awareness. Reality had grown translucent, and through its thin membrane, he could feel the pulse of something ancient, vast, and deeply intertwined with every fiber of his being. It began subtly, like the first tremors before an earthquake. At odd moments, flashes of memory that were not his own would surge through him, unbidden. He would find himself standing still in a grocery store aisle, hand frozen halfway to a box of cereal, as visions overtook him, towers of glass and songs spiraling into alien skies, beings woven from tendrils of golden light moving among gardens that floated midair, children not of flesh but of pure thought, laughing as they shaped constellations with their hands. Each vision was vivid beyond the limits of dreaming, saturated with a clarity and weight that pressed against the walls of his mind. And each time, the same sensation would follow a sharp pang behind his eyes, as if some ancient lock were groaning under the strain of slow, inevitable awakening. One evening, as the sun melted into a pool of fire beyond the horizon, he wandered into the nearby woods, driven by a need he could neither name nor resist. The trees loomed like sentinels, their branches intertwined into cathedral-like arches, and the wind carried with it not only the scent of pine and earth but a tapestry of voices too old for language, yet heavy with meaning. As he moved deeper into the forest, the ground beneath his feet softened, as if the earth itself was breathing. The light dimmed into a soft, violet twilight, and then he saw it, an outcropping of stone, half buried in moss and shadow, unlike anything else in the forest. It jutted from the earth at an angle, its surface covered in strange, spiraling symbols that seemed to shift and shimmer when viewed from the corner of the eye. Drawn to it as if by magnetic force, he reached out and pressed his palm against the stone. In that instant, the world collapsed inward. A torrent of memories, vast and terrible, surged through him, civilizations rising and falling like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant, worlds spinning into being only to dissolve into silence, stars kindling and dying in long, mournful symphonies of light. And among them, he saw the architects, beings older than time as he knew it, not masters of technology but of consciousness itself. They moved not through space but through awareness, weaving threads of potential across the stars, planting seeds within the consciousness of emerging worlds. Seeds not meant to bloom until the soil of the soul had ripened through millennia of growth, struggle, and yearning. He saw Earth as they saw it, not as a planet of nations and wars, but as a single, fragile tendril of life reaching toward the stars, trembling on the cusp of awakening. And he saw himself not as an individual, but as a vessel, a carrier of a spark that had been embedded deep within the human story since its first breath. The realization shattered him and rebuilt him in the same moment. He was not special. He was not chosen. He was part of a pattern so vast, so delicate, that it had required millions of years of patience, countless lives interwoven through endless generations, to prepare this single moment of ignition. Tears streamed down his face, though he barely noticed them. Around him, the forest pulsed with the slow, solemn rhythm of breathing stars. The moss under his feet glowed faintly, casting the clearing in a dim, ethereal radiance. And then, as the final echoes of the vision faded, he heard it again, that whisper, not through his ears but through the very marrow of his bones. It is time. He staggered back from the stone, gasping, trembling, feeling as though every atom of his being had been rewritten. The ground beneath him, the air around him, the beating of his heart, all of it now thrummed with a new frequency, a new song. He was no longer simply a man. He was a seed, ripening. And soon, he would have to choose, to wither back into sleep, or to bloom and awaken the world. The forest lingered within him long after he left its shadowed embrace. Days passed in a strange haze where time itself seemed elastic, sometimes stretching unbearably thin, sometimes coiling tightly around fleeting moments of revelation. Every sensation, Every encounter, every breath carried a hidden depth, as if the world around him had become a symphony composed in a language he had only begun to comprehend. The first true resonance came unexpectedly. It was morning, and the city was stirring awake, the streets humming with the muted clatter of tires on asphalt and the blurred murmurs of countless human lives overlapping. As he stood at a busy intersection, the overwhelming tide of sound and motion threatened to pull him under. But then, amidst the chaos, he felt it, a thin thread of harmony weaving through the noise, subtle yet unmistakable. It vibrated inside him, pulling at something deep within his chest. He closed his eyes. And the world transformed. The honking horns dissolved into the low thrumming of existence. The chatter of pedestrians became rivers of intent and emotion, flowing around and through each other like braided streams. Beneath it all was a bass note, a deep, pulsing resonance that seemed to bind every living thing together, an inaudible song that connected the trembling of a sparrow's wing to the sigh of an old man waiting for a bus, the laughter of a child to the silent blooming of a flower in a distant window box. It was everywhere. And it was beautiful beyond description. He realized then that the universe was not a random cacophony of separate lives colliding blindly. It was a carefully tuned instrument, each being a string vibrating at its own frequency, contributing to a vast, living melody. And somehow, impossibly, he could hear it. He could feel the resonances where lives brushed against each other, altering their courses in imperceptible but profound ways. He began to experiment, tentatively at first. A gentle thought sent outward toward a stray dog led it to pause and look up at him, tail wagging uncertainly. A small focusing of intent calmed a crying infant across the street, as if the air itself had thickened into a comforting embrace. Even the trees lining the avenue seemed to lean subtly toward him, their branches murmuring secrets in the old, slow language of growth and memory. And yet, it was not power he felt, but responsibility. The resonance was not something to be manipulated like a tool, it was something sacred, something alive. To impose his will upon it without understanding would be like striking a delicate harp with a hammer. No, he had to listen. To learn its patterns. To find his place within the song before daring to add his own voice. That night, back in the solitude of his room, he sat cross-legged on the floor, the faint glow of the city bleeding through the curtains. He closed his eyes and let the resonance fill him, let it carry him inward, deeper and deeper, past the noise of thoughts, past the surface tensions of muscle and breath, down into the cavernous stillness at the core of his being. There, suspended between heartbeat and breath, he saw it, a structure of shimmering light, complex beyond reckoning yet simple in its truth. It was a map not of places, but of frequencies. A latticework of connections stretching outward, linking him not only to the beings of Earth but to something far beyond, something that had been waiting, patiently, silently, across the dark oceans of the stars. The resonance code was not a tool to be used. It was an invitation. A path. He wept without sound, overwhelmed by the beauty and the terrible enormity of it. Somewhere deep within him, a seed he had never known he carried pulsed once, twice, then began to unfold. And as it did, the last remnants of the old world, the world he had once known as ordinary, crumbled quietly into dust behind him. He was no longer the man he had been. He was becoming something more. Something ancient. Something inevitable. And somewhere beyond the fragile shell of the earth, in the fathomless black where light was born and died, ancient eyes turned once more toward him, watching, waiting for him to take the next step. The resonance had changed him, but it had not changed him alone. At first, the signs were subtle, almost easy to dismiss as coincidence. a barista at the corner cafe staring off into space, lips moving silently as if in deep conversation with someone unseen. A child in the park laughing hysterically at the invisible patterns dancing above the fountain's spray. A bus driver pausing mid-route, hand pressed to his chest, eyes wide with awe or terror. The world had begun to tremble at the edges, and he could feel it vibrating through the web of resonance that connected all living things. Some strands grew taut with tension, vibrating violently, others frayed and snapped, sending shudders through the unseen fabric of consciousness. The awakening was spreading. But unlike him, guided gently through dream and memory, tempered by revelation, these others stirred into awareness raw and unprepared. The flood of perception crashed over them like a tidal wave, and without the context or understanding to ground them, many flailed helplessly in the currents of sensation and memory now ripping through their minds. He encountered the first of them 2 days later, on a street where the city gave way to crumbling warehouses and forgotten lots. A woman sat cross-legged on the cracked pavement, her clothes stained, her face streaked with tears. Around her, a halo of fluttering birds circled, their patterns strangely symmetrical, as if drawn by an invisible equation unfolding in the air. As he approached, her eyes snapped open. They were not the eyes of a stranger anymore, they were mirrors, reflecting a depth of terror and wonder he knew too well. She spoke not with words but with a surge of emotion that slammed into him like a physical force: desperation, confusion, a longing to return to the simplicity of unawareness. He knelt beside her, instinct guiding his movements. Gently, cautiously, he extended a thread of resonance toward her, a lifeline woven from compassion and steadying thought. Slowly, her trembling subsided. The birds drifted higher into the sky, their chaotic patterns dissolving into the ordinary currents of wind. She whispered one word before collapsing into sleep in his arms: "They're waking." And she was right. Over the next days, it grew worse. On crowded sidewalks, in office lobbies, in suburban cul-de-sacs, the signs multiplied, people freezing mid-step as torrents of forgotten dreams and alien visions overwhelmed them, bursts of inexplicable emotion shattering the brittle veneer of normalcy, moments of perfect, terrifying clarity where strangers locked eyes across a room and knew without question that they were not alone, had never been alone. He could feel their struggles through the resonance network, feel their fear and confusion surging like storms across the interconnected field of awakening consciousness. Some tried to suppress it, drowning themselves in distractions, in noise, in denial. Others embraced it recklessly, casting themselves into the deep currents without understanding, tearing at the delicate strands that bound mind to body, self to world. And there were darker ripples too, echoes of something else stirring in the depths, something that did not rejoice at the awakening but recoiled from it. A presence older than fear, born from eons of slumber and ignorance, now threatened by the rising light. He realized with a grim certainty that the awakening was not without consequences. The resonance was not a gift freely given. It was a test. A threshold. And not all who crossed it would survive intact. Standing atop a lonely hill overlooking the glittering sprawl of the city, he felt the song of the world shift once again, a discordant note threading its way through the harmony, a tremor that hinted of greater storms to come. He was no longer merely an observer. He had become a node, a keystone in the lattice of awakening. And whether he wanted it or not, the weight of countless fragile minds had begun to lean toward him, seeking anchor, seeking guidance, or perhaps, simply seeking hope. The stars above him pulsed faintly in the dark velvet sky, silent witnesses to a drama unfolding far below, a drama seeded millions of years ago and now blossoming with both beauty and peril. He closed his eyes and listened to the growing storm in the resonance. The others were stirring. And soon, very soon, he would have to choose: to lead them toward the garden, or to watch them be devoured by the chaos rising in their own awakening. The first signs of resistance came not with violence, but with silence. It was a peculiar kind of silence, a hollowing out of places that once thrummed with life. Parks that used to echo with laughter now stood heavy and mute under leaden skies. Cafes once alive with murmured conversation became sterile chambers where eyes flickered nervously and words died before crossing lips. Even the birds, once tireless heralds of morning, seemed to falter, their songs dissolving into hesitant, broken notes that drifted and vanished like smoke in the cold air. He felt it most acutely in the resonance. Where before the network had been vibrant, a complex, pulsing tapestry of emotions and dreams, now there were patches of stillness, pockets of absence where the frequencies had been drained, leaving behind only dead space. These voids crept through the world like an invisible frost, numbing the minds they touched, silencing the tentative awakenings before they could fully bloom. At first, he thought it might be fear, the natural recoiling of minds overwhelmed by the magnitude of their own becoming. But as he listened deeper, beyond the surface tremors of panic and confusion, he discerned a different signature, darker and more deliberate, a presence that moved with the subtlety of a shadow sliding across the face of the world. It was not simply fear that dulled the resonance. It was suppression. An active, intelligent force. He began to see them, the agents of silence. They moved unnoticed among the crowds, indistinguishable from ordinary people save for the void that clung to them like a second skin. Wherever they passed, the blossoming threads of consciousness withered, retreating into dormancy. They did not speak. They did not act with overt malice. They simply were embodiments of inertia, sowing seeds of doubt, apathy, and forgetfulness in fertile minds. Some were institutions, old structures of power and control amplifying messages of conformity, obedience, despair. Others were more insidious, whispers seated in vulnerable thoughts, subtle distortions of perception that turned wonder into fear, connection into paranoia, hope into ridicule. It was a war fought not with guns or armies, but with ideas, frequencies, the very currents of belief and awareness. And it was being waged in the silence between heartbeats, in the spaces between breaths, where most would never even realize they were under siege. He felt the weight of it bearing down upon him, a vast and formless opposition that sought not to destroy him, but to erase him, to drown his awakening in the grey tide of unconsciousness sweeping once more across the world. There were moments when the temptation to surrender almost overwhelmed him. To slip back into the comfort of ignorance, to pretend he had never seen the garden of stars, never heard the song of the resonance. It would be so easy. Just one choice: to close his mind, to silence the fragile new frequencies trembling within him. But even as the thought formed, he knew it was a lie. The memory of the garden was etched too deeply into his being now. The seed within him had sprouted roots that reached into the very marrow of who he was. To deny it would be to deny his own existence. Standing at the edge of an abandoned plaza, where once the dreams of the city had converged, he watched as people drifted past him like ghosts, their eyes glazed, their steps mechanical. Above them, the sky hung low and heavy, a leaden sheet suffocating the last remnants of twilight. He closed his eyes and reached into the resonance. It was weaker now, battered and frayed, but still alive. In the distant corners of the web, he could feel sparks of resistance, flickering lights refusing to be extinguished. Some burned with fierce, wild defiance, others with quiet, stubborn hope. Together, they wove a fragile, faltering melody of remembrance. And in that moment, he understood. The silent war could not be fought with force. It could not be won by argument or rebellion. It could only be answered by a deeper resonance, a call to memory, to truth, to the unbreakable threads that connected all living things across the gulfs of fear and forgetting. He would not fight the darkness with fists. He would fight it by becoming a beacon. One soul fully awake was more powerful than 10,000 slumbering. And if he could hold the song within him, hold it steady and true against the withering winds, then others might hear it, might remember, might awaken, too. The silent war had begun. But so had the rising of the light. Somewhere deep within him, the seed pulsed once more, stronger now, answering a call that reverberated across the hidden architecture of existence. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the stars pressing down upon him and the weight of all those looking up, silently pleading for a reason to believe. And he stepped forward into the gathering storm. The storm came without warning. Not a storm of clouds and rain, but a storm of thought, of resonance twisted and weaponized, hammering at the fragile lattice of awakening he had nurtured within himself. It swept through the city like a tidal wave, pulling at every fragile thread of consciousness, yanking souls back into the slumber of fear and isolation. He staggered beneath the assault, every fiber of his being straining against the pull. The voices of the silent war rose around him, a chorus of doubt and despair whispering through the streets, through the walls, through the very molecules of air. "You are nothing," they hissed. "You are alone. You are small. Forget. Sleep. Return." But deep within him, beneath the noise, the seed pulsed with a stubborn, patient rhythm, a heartbeat older than memory. He stumbled into an abandoned square, the empty shells of buildings looming like broken teeth under a sky swirling with heavy iron clouds. The ground trembled beneath his feet, not from any physical tremor, but from the clash of frequencies tearing through the fabric of the world. He dropped to his knees, pressing his palms against the cold stone, and closed his eyes. There, in the darkness behind his lids, he saw it, the seed, no longer dormant, but straining, shuddering, yearning to bloom. Its surface, once smooth and perfect, was now crisscrossed with fine cracks of light, as if an entire universe was pressing outward from within, desperate to be born. But it could not break free alone. It needed him, his will, his surrender, his courage to complete the activation. And with that realization came fear, deep and primal. Because to allow the seed to bloom would mean the end of him as he was. The comfortable boundaries of self, the illusion of separateness, the fragile edifice of individuality he had clung to his whole life, all would be shattered. He would become something new, something vast and terrifying, something he could not control or predict. The storm intensified, the dark resonance roaring like a living thing, battering against the walls of his mind. Forget. Sleep. Obey. He gritted his teeth, tears of strain and rage streaming down his face. He could feel the tendrils of despair reaching for him, wrapping around his spirit, pulling him down into the numb abyss where memory and hope were ground to dust. And still, the seed pulsed, waiting, patient, ancient. A choice. It had always been about choice. Not imposed by any external force, not demanded by gods or fate, but offered freely, the choice to awaken, or to return to sleep. His hands curled into fists against the stone. He thought of the garden of stars. He thought of the web of resonance, of the countless fragile lights flickering in the darkness, each one a soul reaching blindly for connection, for meaning. He thought of the woman in the street, the children laughing at invisible dances, the old man with tears in his eyes as forgotten dreams brushed his heart. They were all waiting. Not for a savior. Not for a leader. But for a signal, for one voice, one soul to hold the frequency steady, to remind them of what they had always known deep within their bones, that they were more than flesh, more than fear, more than the lies whispered by the dark. He screamed not in anger, but in defiance, in love, in remembrance, and hurled his consciousness inward, toward the seed. The impact was cataclysmic. Light erupted through him, shattering the chains of fear, burning away the accretions of doubt and despair. He felt himself fracturing, dissolving, not into nothingness, but into everything. His mind expanded outward, past the limits of skin and bone, past the narrow corridors of thought, into a vastness so immense it defied comprehension. He was the stone beneath him. He was the wind tearing through the hollow buildings. He was the flickering lights of the city, the sleeping hearts of its people, the trembling hope still buried in forgotten corners. He was the resonance itself, vibrating across the tapestry of existence. And at the center of it all, the seed within him burst open. From it bloomed not flowers, not trees, but waves of pure frequency, cascading outward in rings of shimmering, invisible light, touching everything, awakening sleeping potentials, stirring the ancient memories hidden in the marrow of every living being. The storm recoiled as the first wave struck it, the dark resonance faltering, sputtering, breaking apart like mist before a rising sun. He rose slowly to his feet, no longer bound by the gravity of fear. His body was still flesh, but it burned with an inner light, a steady beacon against the receding tide of darkness. Above him, the swirling clouds split open, revealing a sky not of gray despair, but of endless, starlit possibility. He had activated the seed. He had become the signal. And now, the world would hear it. The final movement of the Great Awakening had begun. The world did not change in a thunderclap of revelation. It changed in whispers, in the slow blossoming of unseen seeds, in the quiet trembling of ancient chords finally struck once more. The first signs were almost imperceptible. A tired mother, cradling her child on a crowded subway, suddenly feeling the heartbeat of her child merge with the rhythm of the earth beneath the tracks, and knowing, without words, that she was never truly alone. A boy standing atop a deserted rooftop, gazing at the endless stars, feeling a pull in his chest as if those distant lights were not strangers but family, long lost, and now calling him home. An old man pausing at the threshold of his modest apartment, breathing deeply, and weeping in gratitude at the realization that the walls around him, the floor beneath him, the very air he moved through were all alive, all singing, all waiting for him to remember. The resonance spread not as a flood but as a rising tide, lifting hearts and minds in its gentle, relentless swell. Across cities and forests, across oceans and deserts, threads of awareness reconnected, weaving humanity once more into the living tapestry from which it had long been sundered. He moved through this new world not as a conqueror, not as a prophet, but as a gardener. Wherever he walked, the seed's frequency blossomed, coaxing forth the dormant potentials slumbering within the souls of those he touched. In his presence, people remembered not in their minds, but in their bones, in their dreams, in the spaces between their thoughts what it meant to belong to something vast, beautiful, and eternal. And slowly, subtly, the landscape itself responded. In abandoned lots, weeds once dismissed as nuisances wove themselves into intricate patterns, geometric tapestries of green and gold whispering sacred mathematics to those who dared to listen. Trees in forgotten parks bent their branches in unfamiliar ways, forming arches and circles that seemed almost deliberate. Rivers carved new, meandering paths, sketching unseen glyphs into the skin of the earth. The garden was returning not as a place, but as a state of being. A reflection of the world when seen through awakened eyes. At night, the stars above gleamed brighter, and some swore they could hear faint melodies threading between them, songs older than language, carrying the memory of gardens that once spanned galaxies. The boundary between dream and waking grew thin, and sometimes, just sometimes, those who dared to look deeply enough saw glimpses of the greater pattern, a lattice of light stretching from heart to heart, from world to world, from soul to soul. He stood once more at the hill overlooking the city, the same place where he had first felt the tremors of the silent war. But now, the city below shimmered with a different kind of life. The lights of 1,000 homes pulsed in subtle synchronization, not from any visible hand, but from the quiet, shared awakening of those within. He closed his eyes and listened. Not with his ears, but with the fullness of his being. And he heard it, the song. No longer a fragile, tentative murmur, but a rising symphony of consciousness, vibrant and unstoppable. A smile, slow and wonder-filled, crossed his lips. The work was not finished. It would never truly be finished. Awakening was not an event but a process, a continual unfolding. There would be setbacks, moments of fear, of forgetting. But the seed had been activated. The garden had been reborn. And no force, no darkness, no storm of silence could unmake what had begun. He opened his eyes to the starlit sky and raised his arms, not in triumph, but in communion. The universe answered in kind, a pulse of light from a distant cluster of stars, a shiver of resonance through the earth beneath his feet, 1,000 dreams blooming into brilliance in the hearts of those who had, at last, remembered who they truly were. And somewhere, in the vast, singing silence between galaxies, the architects, the ancient weavers of consciousness smiled and turned their gaze toward new horizons. The seed had awakened. The garden had returned. And humanity, at long last, was beginning to bloom. The seed has been awakened. The garden has returned. And the silent symphony of consciousness has begun to rise once more across the universe. Through one man's choice, humanity steps onto a path forgotten for millennia, a path of remembrance, connection, and infinite becoming. Now, we turn to you. If you were the one holding the seed of awakening, would you have the strength to face the storm? Would you choose the unknown, or retreat into the comfort of forgetting? What part of this story touched you the most? Was it the silent war, the hidden resonance, or the moment of transformation? Share your feelings in the comments below. We'd love to know how you would act if you were in his place. Would you listen to the ancient call, or would you turn away? And if you, too, believe that somewhere deep within us, a seed is waiting to bloom, then subscribe to the Alien Storyverse, where we awaken forgotten truths, one story at a time. Your journey has just begun.